Our next presenter is well known to us here at Realize. Dr. Gail Restall is the co-chair of our board of directors. Somehow, she manages to find time to be an associate professor at the University of Manitoba's College of Rehabilitation Sciences. Welcome, Gail.
Thank you very much. I appreciate having the opportunity to present today, particularly being able to reschedule from Tuesday. Have the next slide, please. I want to acknowledge that I am talking to you from Winnipeg. It is Treaty 1 territory, and spring is on the way. Welcome always the first geese who happen to land on a bit of ice, even though there's open water ahead, so it's always a good sign. Treaty 1 territory and the land that I work on, live on, play on, and build relationships on is the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dene Dakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I want to acknowledge that as a descendant of settlers to this land, that I appreciate and honor the care that the Indigenous people have taken over the land over many thousands of years. Have the next slide, please. What I'm going to talk to you today about is a decision guide that was developed to support decision-making processes for people it was originally developed for people living with HIV to make decisions about whether to disclose their health status in the workplace. I want to acknowledge in the development of that work the great number of people who have worked on different phases of the project over time. So I'm going to talk today about the development of that project and acknowledge the folks that helped along the way. Realize has been instrumental in both agreeing to host the decision guide as well as providing support and direction along the way. Also like to acknowledge the University of Manitoba and their financial support for the project. The next slide, please. So my objectives today are really to introduce you to the Workplace Disclosure Decision Guide. I want to highlight some of the underlying principles that we believed were really important for the development of the decision guide, describe the process of developing the guide, and let you know where you'll be able to find it. Next slide, please. So the Workplace Disclosure Decision Guide is an online interactive tool that prompts consideration of factors that may influence whether a person discloses their health condition in a workplace. As I mentioned earlier, we originally developed the guide with people living with HIV in mind, and largely because HIV tends to be a very stigmatized and invisible disability, obviously an episodic disability as well. And so there's fluctuations in health and wellness over time. And so disclosure decision-making tends to be often a very complex and difficult decision for people. So the guide was really developed with those kinds of thoughts in mind. Next slide, please. So the underlying principles. So these often should be self-evident, but just want to emphasize that we approach this project from the idea that people really have the right to make decisions about whether or not, how, and to whom to disclose their health status. That many personal, social, environmental, economic, and political factors can influence disclosure decisions. And so that decision-making process often really needs to consider all of a whole gamut of factors that may influence an individual. And acknowledging, of course, that disclosure can have risks and benefits associated with it. The next slide, please. So developing the guide. This was a multi-phased, collaborative, and participatory process. And it was guided by the Ottawa Decision Support Framework. So we know that there have been a number of decision aids that have been developed for making complex medical decisions, particularly when there isn't a clear choice involved with it. And so decision guides have been made to help people who have chronic health conditions to make decisions about a course of action for their medical treatment. And so we took some of those ideas from developing those decision support aids that have been developed already and applied them to making a complex social decision, that of making a disclosure decision in the workplace. With the next slide, please. So this was the process that we took in our journey of developing the guide. So we started with an environmental scan and a cross-country survey of people, asking about what kinds of supports there were available for people to make disclosure decisions, what kinds of things folks were doing. So we surveyed or sent the survey to people living with HIV, to folks who support peer support workers, nonprofit organizations who support people living with HIV, and asked them what kinds of supports that were available for people making disclosure decisions in the workplace, what kinds of things they did, and what they thought might be needed. So one of the things that we found from that environmental scan and the cross-country survey was that folks felt that there was some resources available, but they weren't always what they needed, that more resources would be helpful in terms of really the decision-making process. So subsequent to that, we had a community forum, and within the community forum, we again invited people from across Canada, and we saw it as a knowledge exchange kind of process. So we wanted to share the results that we obtained from the survey and the environmental scan, and then get input from folks that attended the forum about what they thought might be needed. And if we did develop a decision support tool for people, what that might look like, or what were the most important things that had to be included within this particular tool. So we had a day-long forum, we had lots of discussion, we had folks participating in terms of telling us what they saw were the most important things that we should consider when we were developing the decision guide. So we took the information that we got from the environmental scan and the cross-country survey and the information that we got from the knowledge exchange community forum, and we designed the decision guide. And so all of that information was transformed into a high fidelity interactive online prototype. And we took that prototype and we did a proof of concept and a validation process. Can I have the next slide, please? So the proof of concept and validation process consisted of recruiting 14 people, and they were people living with HIV, as well as service providers, and some people identified as someone living with HIV, some folks identified as a service provider, and some folks identified as being both a service provider and a person living with HIV. And we used something called the Think Aloud approach as participants scrolled through the prototype decision guide. So the decision guide was online. It was a prototype, so it wasn't fully functional. And then we asked people to scroll through the decision guide and then to talk about what their opinion was as they were scrolling through the guide. Things that they maybe didn't find clear enough, things that they wondered about, things that they thought were missing. So they really had an opportunity to share what they were thinking during the process of scrolling through the decision guide. And then we did a semi-structured interview just to talk a little bit more about our participants' experiences of disclosure decision making, and again talking about the decision guide itself and how they felt it could be useful, usable, whether it was comprehensive, those kinds of questions. We audio recorded that whole process, so the Think Aloud part of the interview as well as the semi-structured interview. And we audio taped that, transcribed, and then analyzed the transcriptions. So what we found were a number of things about the decision guide and the disclosure decision-making process. But what I want to emphasize today is really focused on the decision guide itself. So there was a lot of consensus that the decision guide was comprehensive, it was acceptable and useful. And the usefulness varied a lot. We had some folks who felt that they knew the information that was available in the guide already. Many of these people had been either working as service providers in the HIV sector for a long time or had been living with HIV for a long time. But there was also a sense that it would be particularly useful for people who were perhaps newly diagnosed or who were entering a new situation in which they maybe had more questions about disclosure. And then the real emphasis, both from the decision guide, prototype concept, and validation process, as well as the community forum and our survey, emphasized really that it was important to include individual, interpersonal, workplace, organization, community, and social policy factors in considering decision making. And one of the highlights of what folks thought was really important with the decision guide was its educational process in giving people information about their rights, for example, around disclosure decision making, and encouraging folks to think more about what all they needed to consider when they were making a disclosure decision. Have the next slide, please. So this is what the website will look like. It's still in a draft phase. Realize it will be located on Realize's website. And so the original disclosure decision guide was developed specifically for people living with HIV. And Realize has done work in terms of translating that to a more generic guide for people living with episodic disability. So the two versions are quite parallel, but the version for people living with episodic disability is a little more generic. The version for people living with HIV has more specific information, particularly about living with HIV. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is just a focus on what the decision guide content looks like. So each of those boxes is one of the pages of the decision guide. There's, of course, the landing page, a page about privacy and confidentiality. One of the features of the decision guide is there's a privacy mode. So if people are on the guide, working with the guide, and they want to, as somebody else comes into the room, they can click on the privacy node. Talking about how the guide can be useful, why it might be why disclosure might be a difficult decision, rights disclosure, around disclosure, thinking about their own particular workplace, the kinds of supports they have at work, other things that are going on in their life that might influence whether they want to make this decision or not, and the extent to which they want to make a decision, their supports, values about disclosure, and then gives them an opportunity. So there's places where they can interact, check boxes, answer in longhand, different ideas, talking about their opinions about disclosure, and then whether they've made a disclosure decision, whether they, and different options for disclosure in terms of how much, what, to whom, those kinds of things. So giving them folks an opportunity to really think about that it's not an all or one issue. There can be a whole range of disclosure decisions, including not disclosing at all. And then there's a list of resources for people to get more information. Have the next slide, please. So folks have talked about many applications for employees, employers, advocates, peer support workers to use the decision guide as a tool. Next slide, please. And one more. So thanks very much. That's how you can contact me if you want more information.
Thank you so much, Gail, for your excellent work.